Hi, and good day from wherever you're watching, because this is a virtual session for YeurDreamin. We're very happy to be here with you. And of course, we're very thankful to the sponsors, PDF Butler and the Trailblazer community, as well as the organizers of YeurDreamin. So today we are going to talk about the communication skills that any architect needs to hone. And who are we? Well, I am Lilith van Biesen. I'm a principal architect director at Capgemini. I'm also a CTA. And I have with me the one and only Miriam McCabe.
Woo, yes, so I work at Salesforce as an RVP, also known as Senior Director, and I lead the Innovation Design team, and I'm also a CTA.
All right, so it's the double trouble of CTAs, I think. We're safe to continue. And of course, while we want to talk about the communication skills of an architect, it might be good to talk about, what is the role of an architect, and maybe even starting even smaller, what is an architect? So as we did our due diligence, let's say, we went to a few recognized sources and we asked Merriam-Webster, what is an architect? And according to them, an architect is a person who designs and guides a plan or undertaking, which is all good and fine, but to be honest, is a bit vague for our understanding. So we came up with something better. So according to Lilith and Miriam, or Miriam Lilith, an architect is an expert in their domain, a bridge between domains and stakeholders. And very importantly, they come in many flavors. All are equally great. If you want to know more about that, that's why we include some extra reading about Gemma's 5 types of Salesforce architects, as well as the Salesforce architect credentials, where you can see a lot of different flavors as well. But that's not the only thing that architects are, right, Miriam?
Yes, thank you, Lilith. According to Merriam-Webster, an architect is also complementary to a project manager, right? So when you think about planning and the word planning, you might think, isn't that the realm of a project or a program manager, right? But a takeaway from this slide and this short section is that there are many leaders on any given engagement, and there's a need for many different types of leaders. So where a project manager is going to be looking at the schedule, maybe at the milestones, and do communication on a higher level, an architect is actually going to lead the team to getting a lot of these activities to the done state, right? And they might actually also help the project manager come up with additional activities for the plan, such as, for example, I don't know, the firewall needs to be opened, which is something that the project manager would never have come up with, right? So in terms of communication, which is what this session is about, the way or the content of that communication is very different. So a PM is going to be talking a lot of the times about what and when, and the architect is going to talk a lot about the how and the why. So if we move to the next slide, if we go a little bit deeper on what the architect's communication is like, kind of like a traditional way to look at this is as a bridge, right? A bridge between, on the one hand, the business, and on the other hand, the IT. And how can you become a good bridge? How can you make sure that you can build foundations that last as long as those beautiful canal bridges in Amsterdam that we see here, right? And it's like, on the business side, it means that you bring some of those foundations. So you need to understand and bring a deep knowledge of the use cases, and you need to champion the needs of the end users. But you also need to respect the knowledge and the experience that already lives in the business, right? And so invite subject matter experts into the relevant meetings, so that you're making sure that you're implementing the right changes. And also, incidentally, this is going to help you with the adoption of the solution further on as well. You will also work very closely with the leaders, and always keep an eye on the end-to-end process. I think, Lilith, we cannot emphasize that enough, right? End-to-end process, making sure that it's unified as much as possible. So that's the business hat. And then on the other foundation, there is the IT side, right? Where you need to be able to understand all the things that are possible and not possible, understand how difficult it's going to be to implement and also to maintain, where necessary, define those best practices, everything that you can do to make sure that the solution that you're implementing is durable, lasting, and stable. And so there's a lot of balance here, right? A lot to balance here as well. If you look to the next slide, you see a lot of things that an architect takes the lead on across the business, across delivery, and across of technology. There's some extra reading included here as well to take a look at all the various jobs to be done in the B2C and B2B contexts. Anyhow, all of this leadership requires a lot of communication to get right? And this is why I'm going to hand it over to Lilith to talk to us about why communication matters.
Yeah, thank you so much. And of course, I think we're going to put on our CTA hats a bit again, because of course that's where we encountered our first big challenge, let's say, when it came to communication and why it matters. Because if we look at the CTA context, which is of course very niche, we are aware, we're dealing there with the C-level audience. We know that the judges will likely be multitasking, right? They're trying to understand what we're saying. They're also trying to understand to what extent our solution covers the needs and covers different domains as well. It's also, with 45 minutes as duration, a very long time to pay attention, yet a very short time to really convey everything that you need to convey. And often, as is the case with your speakers today, their speakers might be non-native, or the audience might be non-native. This also adds another layer of complexity and, yeah, a whole new opportunity for misunderstanding, let's say. So that is a CTA context, and that's what we, of course, trained a lot on, and where we also learned the value of communication. However, if you try to bring this to any context that an architect might find themselves in, you'll see that there might be a mix of expertises and backgrounds. They have their different concerns and interests. These are things to keep in mind when you're trying to bring a message to these people, when you're trying to convince them of a certain element or a certain solution that you have proposed. So it's always good to keep that background or those different backgrounds in mind. They might also be multitasking. I think, especially when you think virtual settings, you have your Outlook open, or there's maybe another conversation happening in the background, or maybe your cat is next to you making all kinds of weird noises. There could be a multitude of things that cause confusion or cause a bit of distraction. So that's also something to keep in mind in the way that you construct your communication, is to not look at this in kind of a vacuum, not look at this in the best possible situation, but keep in mind that there might be some obstacles hindering the full story that you're wanting to bring, and it being absorbed by the other, by the audience. That is important to keep in mind in your communication as well. And then likely, of course, they might also have limited time available, because if you are talking to decision makers, usually their agendas are quite packed. So you need to keep in mind that, again, make sure that the time that you have, you use it as wisely as you possibly can. And doing that really, really relies on good communication skills. And again, it could be that they're all non-native. It could be that there's a lot of native speakers. Either way, it's good to at least prepare for non-native speakers so that it's easier, let's say, if you have a room full of native speakers, but you don't get surprised. And we'll also come back to some of the techniques that non-native speakers can use when working on their communication. But first, let's tackle this challenge. So we have different expertises. They might be multitasking. Our audience might be multitasking. And we have limited time available. How are we going to solve for this? Well, we're going to work on our storytelling. We need to really think about what is the communication that we want to bring, what is the message we want to bring, and how do we walk through this. We, of course, need to bring the context. We need to bring the people into the particular setting that we want to dive into, whether it is a full process that we're going to walk through, whether it is a very high level overview of the system and the needs that you want to propose. Doesn't really matter. Bring them into that context and then walk them through challenge, solution, conclusion. A lot of these very traditional things that will help you keep the focus and will help them understand where you're going. don't jump from one topic to another because it will get confusing. Make sure that you're building up and also sometimes calling back into things you've already said. Another thing very important, especially for those multitaskers, is to make sure we have the visual and auditory variation. Because if I would talk in a very monotone way, if I had slides with only text, and especially a lot of text on it, it would get very boring and very easy to tune out. So we need to make sure there's some variation to make sure our audience keeps their focus and that they are with us in every step of the story that we want to tell. We can do this visually, like through artifacts, which we will cover later on. We can also do this through intonation, which you might have captured already a bit, that I'm trying to really put a lot of emotion and empathy and also focus in my voice on specific elements I want to call out. And then finally, really important, in the story that we're gonna tell, we want to, of course, make sure we tell an end-to-end story. For example, if we cover a process, we cover a process really end-to-end. And that is always clear. That is the red thread throughout. And then afterwards, or in some parts of that red thread, we can go into detail. But that is the second part. The most important part is going to be the main story that we want to bring. We can go into a few little pools of detail here and there where it makes sense, but we need to pick those wisely, because if we start doing that everywhere, our main story will likely get lost and our whole communication or message will get muddled or confusing. Another final thing to do here, and especially when it comes to making sure that you tailor to the right audience and making sure that you use your time as wisely as possible, is use specific vocabulary. If you're talking to a specific industry and they have a jargon that makes sense for them, then try to use that jargon, because it will make it very recognizable for them. They will hear themselves in the message that you're trying to bring, because it's really flavored to the kind of words and vocabulary that they're used to seeing, that they're used to interacting with on a day-to-day basis. And all of these things will make it easier for them to keep being engaged, keep in their focus. And all of these, of course, are one and the only communication. So if you're doing these things, you're already honing your communication skills. However, we need to talk about why do we communicate, because we've already talked a bit about the message, the audience and the different elements that are in there. But the reason that we communicate is because we want to make complex concepts as easy to understand as possible for the specific audience that we have in front of us. So that means that even though, let's say, you're tackling a very technical topic like data migration, even though it's a technical topic, if we have a business audience, we need to really think about what are the elements of this bigger topic that is necessary for them to know, and what are the most complex elements there. How do we make it easy for them to understand? Because it's not about showing off how complex our work is, right? We want to make sure that they understand what steps in the process, what steps in the project will be happening. This will allow us to have a shared understanding of both, what is the goal, what are we trying to achieve, and what are the strategies through which we are trying to achieve this. So going with an example, if we take a very, very small context, a very, very small setting, so not like our CTA scenario is a lot smaller. We have a global consumers good company. They have a ton of siloed orgs, and they want to enable their field agents by having a mobile app which can offer barcode scanning as well as document management, and also has extensive offline capabilities. So it really depends on who are we talking to when we're going to be presenting or discussing it, even just this particular situation where we have a particular organization, which is a global consumers company, who needs a specific solution for a specific target group, their field sales agents. Now, let's take the example of the offline capabilities, right? This is something that we know could be a risk, because this is not that easy to set up, and especially also depending on which technology they're going to choose. We can see that there will be some complexities for example, about the consolidation of data, making sure we don't have data consistency issues, because if you're writing things or updating records in one system, but it's not syncing because it's offline at that time, then how are we going to make sure that the right data gets stored in the end? What is the data survivorship going to be like? These things that I've mentioned, these risks or these concerns, are very relevant when I'm talking to IT. They're not that relevant, or at least not in that wording, when I'm talking to business. When I'm talking to business, I need to come with answers, and I need to also really think about what do I want to discuss with them. The technicality of how data survivorship will happen is not relevant to them. However, with them, it might be interesting to discuss, okay, so which capabilities need to happen offline and which may happen at the later stage when, you know, the system is online again, when the mobile app is within reach of a network again. And how are we going to make sure that this fits within the persona, within the process that this field sales agent needs to follow, or needs to walk through and live through every day? So again, think about the risks and mitigations that we want to address here. Think about the stakeholders for whom this is relevant, and when do we want to relay what to whom. Again, the whole data survivorship, some of this will be discussed with business likely at some point, but not the whole issue as a big risk or as a big problem, but broken down into the elements that are relevant for them. And when we will communicate that, we will also be already communicating how we intend to mitigate this risk. We will already bringing a solution, because if we're not doing that, then going back to what is an architect, well, it's a lead, right? They're a leader, they take ownership, and that is exactly what they need to do in their communication as well. Really think about why or when am I communicating this to whom? Because if I'm just bringing this up as, oh, this is a risk, without really having a plan, the chances of me causing chaos rather than, you know, streamlining the process are too high. So we talked about the what, the message. We talked about the who, the audience. Now let's talk about how we want to communicate these things. Going back to you, Miriam.
Yes, thank you, Lilith. So first off, maybe you will have noticed that when you listen to other people, other speakers, and other presenters, that some of them are super engaging, right? And they truly have their own style. So we start here with a disclaimer, and that is to say that it is fine, and it's even like a good idea to be inspired by the styles of others, and that you can also kind of learn from the styles and the things that other people do. But in order for it to work and for you to come across in an authentic way, the aim is to find your own style, right? And so nobody is born with a style, right? So once you do it in a certain way, or when you're just starting, that doesn't mean that it's always going to be like that, right? You can take what you observe in others and then tweak it and adjust it and bring in certain elements. And like that, over time, you will shape your own style. You try it, you test out some things, and if it works for you, it becomes part of that style. So like being insecure, just like on the previous one, and then sorry. So being insecure or unfocused or long-winded or talking to the slides instead of about them are not style, right? How you use your voice, or how you hold your body, how much energy you bring, how often you refer to your pets when you're speaking, how you're engaging the audience, right? Those are the things that I'm talking about. And so all the other pieces are kind of the techniques that you can learn and make your own. So now if we move on to the next slide, let's dive into some of the mechanics, right, of how you can communicate. And there's typically two big categories. Lilith already alluded at them previously, and they are verbally, right, using words and narrative, and visually using gestures, pictures, or in the context of an architect, oftentimes beautiful artifacts, right? And so you're always also keeping in mind that you're usually always using both of these at the same time. So you can make use of that. So let's start with the verbal communication, right? So nothing is more boring I think, than listening to somebody drone on with no idea of where they're going, right? So most important of all, for me, to be engaging is to let there be a point, a red thread, a theme, something that takes all those nuggets that you're bringing and holds it together in a meaningful way, right? So for example, at this point, you all are probably, hopefully, still engaged because you know that I'm currently talking about verbal communication and that soon I'm going to switch to visual communication, right? And this type of hook allows you to organize the information and makes it also easier for you to stay engaged and listen because you kind of know what's coming and also where to slot it, right? And another piece, and Lilith alluded to this already, is to take it easy on the details. So you start with the highlight, you sprinkle in some detail, and then you go back to the highlight, right? Does this mean never any detail? No, of course not. Sometimes details are super important, right? The devil is in the detail. But just be sure that you pick when you use detail as a tool, as opposed to feeling obliged to share everything you know, right? It's not that difficult to know a lot. What is difficult is to pick out the pieces of what you know that are relevant at this point in time to your audience and to the goal that you're trying to achieve. So on the next slide, if you look at the items on the left, right, that are listed under presentation skill, those will help you do that, right? It's by taking the business problem or the problem that you're trying to solve, or whatever your customer is trying to achieve, their true purpose and goal, as your red thread, as your storyline, right? And then once you know what your message is, you can use that purposeful repetition of a few key items so that you can really bring home the message. And there you can also use a little bit of additional detail every time you repeat the point, for example. Right, and then on the right side, so in summary, like a helicopter view also helps to keep your audience engaged, but it also, as an architect, actually improves the overall solution, right? Also, as an architect, you cannot get drowned in the details. So anyway, so that's about verbal communication. So now let's go into visual communication before I hand it back to Lilith to talk about how we can learn to communicate. You see what I did there? Anyway, so visual communication, right? So the whole aim here is to support the message and not to distract. So that means a visual needs to be aligned to the message that the words are also communicating. And so I think my beautiful picture here is a pretty self-explanatory illustration of this concept, right? In this case, it's very, I'm saying the same thing as I'm showing. In some cases, a visual can also add some additional context or even an additional angle, but that is not that easy, right? So you need to be pretty good at finding the right image without it becoming a distraction. So if we go to the next slide, I have some recommendations around visual communication on slides, for example. So take it easy on the words on a slide. And you might ask yourself, isn't words verbal communication? Yes, they are if you say them. But if you show them on a slide, they're also visual communication. So imagine what it looks like if you have like a million words on the slide. It's not easy on the eyes either. So a good visual helps, supports the story that you're trying to tell. And also a good visual needs to be logical, right? Even a visual should almost have a storyline. Or a flow, right? So and that's what we're trying to say here when saying all the artifacts have a flow internally and together. So break it down, explain the flow of the story, and then also explain how the visual reflects it. And for the extra, reading some very good content from the community around, and maybe also from the well-architected framework, right, around essentials for diagramming. As a reference. So on the next slide, this is an example of an artifact that I've created to explain the various types of AI and how they would fit into an org strategy with in a multi-org situation. So a few things to note is that I have left out more than I've put in, right, in this diagram. So this is not a diagram to explain everything about how these orgs interact with each other. It's only here to tell a story about the types of AI that I want to implement in the various orgs. So you will see that I have a legend that describes what the coloring around the boxes is for the AI types. And that's the most important piece, right? So I'm not giving a legend for any piece on the diagram. And so I'm only focusing on the Agentforce pieces that are going to live in the org and some key elements of the architecture, such as that there is going to be data cloud, that there is going to be a trust layer, talking to LLMs, etc. Right? So I think the takeaway that I would like to have is communication is, be it visually, be it verbally, it's mainly about what you're not saying, so that it can be about what you're saying. And so, having said that, without further ado, let's turn it over to Lilith, who is going to take us home with talking about how you can learn to communicate.
Thank you so much. And I think we've already seen some great examples of communication. Thank you for that, Miriam. And as you can see, it's really about having the right person in the right place. And one of those things in having the right person in the right place is keeping in mind what your role is. So we started by discussing what the role of an architect is. And we know that they are a leader, that they have, some responsibilities and some ownership to take. And in that, communication is key. We've already talked a lot about raising risks. So by now you might be thinking, okay, but if you keep talking about risks, that's a very grim outlook. You don't want to be a Debbie Downer. On the other hand, this is what we do, right? Because it's our responsibility to really make sure that we take ownership of what is going on, of the full project, the full system, and that we really make sure that if we see something, we identify something that might go wrong, that we bring this in a way that is constructive. So we don't just say, this is going to be an issue, and then we just drop that kind of panic into the room. We come with a plan, and that's where mitigation comes in. So if you're raising risks, it doesn't make you a Debbie Downer, as long as you make sure that you also know how to mitigate those risks. And then if we look at the different domains or different attributes that come into a project, you have scope, schedule, quality, and budget. In a perfect world, these will never conflict, and we'll always have perfect scope within the budget with a schedule that is allowing us to have the right quality that we would like. However, unfortunately, we don't live in a perfect world, so there will always be a point where something needs to give. And it's important to keep those dimensions, let's say, in mind, because you'll need to probably, play around with those dimensions a bit. Either you'll need to change the schedule, change the budgets, change the scope, hopefully not change the quality. But again, there are situations sometimes where a temporary or in-between or intermediary solution is needed, where quality might not be an afterthought, but be a longer-term goal. So keep this in mind in how you're going to, communicate your mitigations, but also who are you going to be talking about to? Because there also, what Miriam already mentioned is the difference between architect and PM, which is very, very true. But we're also kind of the best two-person army, let's say, in the sense that there's a lot of collaboration between those two roles. And especially when we're talking about schedule budgets, these are topics we need to bring to the right audience as well. So in collaboration with the PM. And then again, mitigations, solutions, all the things where you as an architect show your expertise and you come with a proposal. Make sure that you do come with a proposal, right? A well-argumented solution or proposal or mitigation or whatever it is. Don't come with options. You might have already looked through some options while getting to the proposal or to the solution, but make sure that you have a point of view. Make sure you have an opinion, and this is what you're going to communicate as well. Of course, we're always going to talk about, the trade-offs of different solutions that we have investigated. Again, always being a bit liberally used here because you need to, again, choose where you put that detail. But When you go over the solutions, or when you go over the trade-offs of the different options, make sure that you make it really clear where you see the preferred option. And in saying what the preferred option is, you're going to again tie it back to the value that you perceive this particular option will bring over the others. Communicating that value, also again relying on your knowledge of who your audience is and what they perceive as value, is going to help you in justifying the decisions or the proposed solutions that you want to bring. I already hinted a bit at the audience, because it's really important. Even if you have the right person, even if you have the right message, you need to think about how do you bring this message for your audience? What matters to them? What concerns do they have? How can you make it relatable to your audience? We already talked a bit about, using the right language to that effect. It could be the jargon, but also it could be a more, language more tied to the perspective, let's say, that they take. So when you're talking about solutions, proposals, risks, anything, think about how will it involve the person that you're talking to? Why is this relevant for them? And how will they look at this? If there is a risk, will there be business impact? If you're proposing something, is there a business case to support that? If you're proposing a particular solution, let's say it's a very specific solution about, again, let's take the data migration one. Will there be a return on investment? If you're proposing to use, for example, an app exchange package, how will this impact your total cost of ownership? And what will be, because of the proposal that you make, the time to market of this solution that you have in mind? These are things that are really, really important for business to understand really what the value is that you're proposing and that your solution will bring. That's why it's really important that you understand what these mean as well, and how this will be of value to them. Because if you don't understand what they value, you will not be able to communicate what you want to bring to the table, the solution that you have in mind, in the right way. So again, combine that technical knowledge that you have to create those solutions, to identify and mitigate those risks, with the business acumen and solid communication skills. Make sure that you approach it from different perspectives. Again, be that bridge that we talked about in the beginning, because that's going to allow you to really understand why certain things matter to certain groups and how you can tie this back into your communication. And then, very importantly, it's not just talk. Sometimes it's also the money is in the pudding. I'm mixing a lot of phrases there, but sometimes it's really important to just have a visual, because you can talk and talk and talk, but there's certain things that you will never be able to really clearly communicate without the right image involved. System landscape, for example, you'll spend 2 hours and still have a different view on what it would look like. So make sure that you use the right visual. And we have some examples here, or we have some different types of visuals here. And again, the resource that we referred to in the past about the diagramming framework, that's the one where you can go to really learn more about these elements. But just in a nutshell, let's say you're talking to more of business or executive stakeholders who want to have an understanding of certain concepts or a vision of what a solution would be like. Then you're going to look at the marketing strategy and sales types of artifacts, of visuals. However, if your purpose is more to help the viewers understand an implementation or a specific technical detail related to the product, then likely you're going to be talking to more delivery teams, technical stakeholders, and these are then more the documentation and implementation type of diagrams that you will create. So those are two broad flavors that you can bring when it comes to visualizations. But another element is as well the level of depth that you want to go into, because it could be that the very, very biggest picture that you can bring is fine. There's a lot of pieces to that puzzle that are there. And again, like Miriam showed in the visual about the Agentforce or AI example, well, really think about what needs to be there. So there's not going to be a lot of fine detail. There's likely going to be a lot of elements that are still there, but we're not going to discuss all of them in a lot of detail. It's just to shape the largest point of view. And then once you have this bigger puzzle, it could be that you're going into a smaller subset of that, where less complexity will be found, because we're not looking at a lot of the things that we had in the bigger picture, but there's still a lot of things going on there. So we're trying to balance and really only add a few smaller details. Even going a bit deeper, let's say, we can go look into a specific process or a particular interaction where, again, we're reducing the complexity, where we're not including anything that's not relevant to that process. We're adding a bit more detail, of course, because anything that is relevant to that process, we can add a bit more body to it. But it's really about this particular process. And then if we want to look at a particular part of that process, that's a double click. There we have very little complexity in the sense of the other things that are surrounding this particular problem that we want to address, or challenge that we want to address, but we're adding a lot more detail to it. So a lot of the things that we as architects do is we take a big challenge or a big problem and we try and break it down into smaller, more manageable problems. The same thing you're going to do with a diagram or an artifact as well. Just break it down into what matters for you. When you're discussing actors, you don't need to discuss the data model, even though, of course, there's a link, because certain licenses will give you visibility to certain objects, but it's not relevant when we're talking about this particular topic. So really think again about what are you leaving out. And sometimes it's, like Miriam mentioned, a lot more that you're leaving out than what you're putting in. We talked a lot about talking. We also did a lot of talking. However, sometimes it's important to really listen and ask the right questions. So putting on our Miriam Lilith dictionary hat again, being an architect is not about having the right answers. It's about asking the right questions. We can all showcase how much we know constantly, but that is not going to get us to any valid endpoint, right? We want to get to a certain outcome. And by really keeping the right communication in mind, we will get there. And that is by knowing what you know and knowing what you don't know. And listening to understand, not to reply. So this means I'm not trying to just showcase how much of an expert I am. I'm trying to understand you and what you need to know. I want to know what you are concerned about. What are the things that you really want to get out of this particular implementation, for example? And in order to do that, I need to ask the right questions. I also can't be afraid to ask dumb questions sometimes, because it's all part of getting that understanding of who this person is, what are their actual concerns, and going a bit deeper. So some kind of questions that you can ask are about context, the who, when, what, where, why, the basics, let's say. But then if we really want to go into the as is and the to be, in order to gauge what is the as is, it's important to ask the 5 whys, which is this idea that if you ask why 5 times, you'll get to the actual reason why something is the way it is. And especially if we're looking at an existing process or an existing system, this is really important, because if we ask it the first few times, the reason might be is because this is how we do it. But if you go in deeper and you want to really understand, okay, but why do we do it this way then? It could be that there's a reason behind it that's very valid, like particular regulation forcing this particular business in this industry to work in this way. That's a very valid one. Another one could be, but the previous system that we used, well, it was not able to do XYZ. That's why we need to do it in this way. That's not a valid reason, right? That's a reason that is there because of a limitation that was there in the past, but it might not be there in the future. So really important to ask those whys, really understand, and really go deeper into what is really going on here beyond the first levels of sometimes superficial details. And then when we're talking about the to-do or to be, well, which is also our to-do, of course, it's important to evaluate how much room for change there is in the process. Because as I was talking about before, if we are doing this in this way because of a regulation, then likely we don't have that much room for change in this, how we do this particular process, because there are some regulatory requirements that we need to fulfill. Again, it could be that we still have some leeway there. I'm not saying that we don't need to follow those regulations. Of course we do. But the how might be a bit more flexible than what we had previously assumed. So it's still good to check. But in other situations, like the example that I gave where we're doing this because that's how we're used to doing this, well, then there might be more room for change in the process, especially also who are we talking about, internal, external stakeholders. There's a lot of things to consider to assess if we have room in the change or to change a process. So this is questions we ask to our stakeholders, to our counterparts. Don't be afraid to ask questions to yourself. It doesn't make you a very odd person talking to themselves. It makes you a very reasonable person, really assessing why I am making certain assumptions, why I am thinking that you want to change your process because of XYZ, while actually there might be a very different reasoning, considerations behind it. So when you are reading, for example, an RFP, or when you are reading a request from a customer or from a prospect, really think about, when you're reading through it, what are the assumptions that you're making? Going back to, for example, those offline capabilities, there could be an assumption that this is something where there is no access to any kind of network for a day. It could be that it's for weeks. I'm assuming a day because that's the situation that is more frequent to my particular environment. But it could be that there's really a lot more challenging situation there. So this is a point that I need to validate with the customer, a question I will need to ask. Also, do I understand the actual context, the needs, and the challenges? We didn't have that much information in that example that we had. So no, probably I don't. So what information do I need to really get this understanding? So you also need to answer questions, because it's good to ask them, but you will likely get some questions in return as well. And there it's important to really think about the message, right? If they are asking a question, there's more ways than one to understand or to read this particular question, read between the lines. Is this question coming from a hidden objection? Do they have a problem that they're asking you as a question? Is there a concern that they're trying to raise through their question? Or is there really just a request for clarification, or they want more in-depth or more detail in the answer that they're expecting? This is really important, especially tying it back to what we mentioned in the beginning, where when you are presenting something, it could be that people are distracted. It could be that they're doing something else. So maybe they truly just missed the part where you were explaining the risks tied to the offline capabilities. It could be that that is exactly what happened, and you need to just pretty much repeat what you already mentioned before. But very often, there is more to that question than just you having to repeat the same thing that you've said before. So really make sure that you understand what they're asking. And if you don't understand exactly what they're asking, it's okay to ask them to, repeat the question or rephrase the question, or you might even go back and say, so do you want me to go deeper into the data survivorship issue? This could be a way to really make sure that you're understanding what they're really wanting to know, and adjust your answer accordingly. It could be that in them asking you questions, some of the assumptions that you had made or some of the requirements that you had seen actually adapt, are changed while you're in the presentation. This is very, very normal. This is something that happens all the time. So you need to be able to adapt to those shifting assumptions and requirements. If they say, yes, indeed, we need the offline capabilities, and they're offline for weeks on end, so there's no syncing in between, then that's what you will need to deal with, and that's what you will need to solve for. And that's fine. That's also when we were talking about, you might have different kind of options in the back of your head, but you did also note the trade-offs and had that preferred option in your mind. This is where reevaluating some of the other options might be a good thing to really see, okay, with this new information that I have, actually this other solution might be better. Make sure whatever you do that you really answer those questions or objections short and to the point. And I'm not saying just yes or no answers, right? You can be a bit more verbose than that, but really keep in mind the same thing that Miriam was saying before, that when you start talking, you know where you want to end and you just don't rattle on, because they want to have an answer to the question that they asked. And it could be, again, that you're misinterpreting what they're actually asking. So if you keep it short and to the point, you leave more room for them to actually get back to you and do a follow-up and ask, actually, I was more interested in this or that. If you go on a tangent, then it's more difficult to redirect the communication. Plus, you'll probably open a few Pandora's boxes along the way that will lead to different kinds of conversation or communication or topics that you will bring on the table. So make sure you're precise, concise, short to the point. And again, those keywords can help in reducing how much you need to explain. Then we have some techniques for the non-native speakers out there. One of the things that I see a lot with people who don't have English as their first language is they use a lot of, let's say, simple words sometimes, which is very normal, of course, but think about how you can use synonyms and variation to really allow the conversation to flow a bit more, to be a bit more engaging, to not have the same repetition of the word do or use constantly. So instead of using use, think leverage. Instead of saying help, maybe facilitate. These kind of things can make your vocabulary more expansive and allow a lot more variation in your explanations as well. There might be some concepts that you need to explain very frequently, or that you feel like are good to have in your back pocket, like the benefits of using an ESB, or how an identity flow works, or how you want to explain an integration. It could be that you just curate a few things there. I put some examples in the slide as well. And these are just, again, some tools that you can use that I feel very confident in explaining this. When I'm talking ESB, I'm talking orchestration, I'm talking error handling. Again, it doesn't have to be this full-blown sentences, but just so that you know what is the right terminology again, and you are answering more to the point. Very important for non-native speakers, practice with different audiences, because I very well could be using a lot of Dutch lists in my normal way of speaking. And if I'm constantly only talking to Miriam, then likely I won't get it, because we both speak Dutch. So if I say something in a way that makes sense, she will understand, and she's probably too polite to interrupt me and say, no, that doesn't make sense. But there's other audiences when I'm speaking to my Spanish colleagues, for example, they will not have a clue what I mean when I'm speaking, Dutchlish. So practice with different audiences, because then you will also learn which kind of literal translations you sometimes do that just don't make sense in English or in whatever language that you're practicing. You also have this technique that's called sight reading or reading ahead. And this is very helpful when you're doing presentations where, for example, you have a few bullets on your slide, or where you're showing a text even. Again, we don't recommend showing too much words, but okay. In such a situation, it's good to do sight reading, which means I'm saying one thing, but I'm already reading ahead and I know what's coming next. And this will allow me to make links more fluently. This will allow me to paraphrase, maybe instead of just reading out loud, which again, paraphrasing in this situation likely is more entertaining because you have different intonation, you have more variation. So this is something that you can practice, and you can practice it very easily by reading books to school children, like I do with my niece and nephew, for example. It helps a ton to just make sure that it's engaging. And if it's not, they will tell you. Then finally, again, curate your content carefully. Make sure that you really think about what is relevant, what is a waste of time. And when in doubt, leave it out. It's always better to just add as you go, or to answer a question going into something or going more in detail later, than losing half of your audience by having too much detail involved. And with that, We hope that we were able to bring some valuable communication skills to light, and that also we were good examples of communication, because that would be embarrassing now, would it not be? But most of all, we want to thank the YeurDreamin organizers, their sponsors, and you as their audience for listening to us during this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.